this is a big deal. This movie, this is big.
Will I be invited on another movie set from beginning to end? I doubt it.
I probably should have tried to talk about it making the movie, but it had Tom Hanks in it.
He is, I think, the most headstrong director I have ever worked with.
Sometimes I think the more money they have, the more stuff it can get.
It makes me sad that it was such a fail.
The Plot Thickens, The Devil's Candy.
It was the most famous book in the world, so it had all the ingredients to make a great movie.
The epic story behind what went wrong on the Bonfire of the Vanities, hosted by Ben Mankiewicz and author Julie Salamon. Listen for free on Apple Podcasts and visit tcm.com/podcast to learn more.
Well, thank you very much. Julie, good morning. Ben, how you doing? Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, my first question is to you. You know, the first season garnered more than 1 million downloads. I just want to know, are you just pleased with how the series began?
Yeah, of course. Very pleased. It was, first of all, it was rewarding to help construct. You know, I'd wanted to do a podcast for some time and had been nagging them and even suggested Peter. But my idea was entirely different. And well, I had suggested Peter for things on the channel, not for the podcast. So I'd been talking about, I thought we should use Peter more, and I wanted to do a podcast. But my idea for using Peter more wasn't as good as this. And my podcast idea was just dumb. And so you got with real storytellers, and I loved working with Angela and Joanne and Susan and the entire team. And it was really satisfying. And it was really interesting to be able to talk to somebody like that, 5-6 sessions, 2 hours each with Peter. I thought that was rewarding too. And I like Peter very much. So I like telling that story. And obviously we're definitely pleased with the reaction. It set a high bar.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. John from the Hollywood Soapbox, your turn.
Hi, thank you for the time today. Julie, I was wondering if you could kind of relay the news of how you actually got so embedded in the production of this movie. It would seem like it's an opportunity that filmmakers and production companies are not going to allow anymore, that close of attention.
So my luck was Brian De Palma. I think we had become friendly through, I was working as a film critic back then. We'd meet from time to time when he was in New York to talk about movies. And I had told him that I was interested in doing this kind of a book, similar to what Lillian Ross had done with Picture many years before in the 50s, following John Huston around. And when he signed on to do Bonfire, he thought that might be a good movie to do it on. And, he was a little bit of a bomb thrower. He kind of liked to rustle feathers in Hollywood. And I guess he thought I would be the person to do it. Obviously, I think he might have thought differently about it if he'd known how the movie was going to end up. But without him, it wouldn't have happened.
I'm going to jump in with something that I know nothing about, except for the part of your question about whether it will discourage others, the Julie's unbelievable access. And then she didn't just have access. It's what she did with the access. Like other people have had access and then, bungled it or created something ordinary. So, I mean, part of the reason that we talk about this movie is because of what Julie did with it. And I'm not just trying to, she already likes me, I think. So, but I think that's really critically important. And I think it's also like if the lesson that Hollywood directors and producers take away from The Devil's Candy is that, we can't grant access like that, they're missing the point. Then this would just be a blockbuster movie that disappointed. Now there's an interesting story around it. And, as long as you have assurances that, that during production, the little things that might get clicks on Twitter won't be used, right? That this is for a book, for something substantive afterwards. I think the lesson ought to be that it ought to happen more. And I'll tell Julie this, I'll tell you guys as I tell it. So I had a little family event. My niece graduated from high school, And my cousin, who is a not insignificant producer at a very significant studio now, and she runs the studio. We're not talking about producer. And she said to me that she thinks, Julie, that she gives every single person in the business who she meets new. She's 40. The devil's candy. And she said, no lie. She goes, I've probably given 100 copies. I bought 100 copies and given it to people. And I was like, okay, you're exaggerating. She goes, all right, if I'm exaggerating, I've given 85, but it might be 110. She goes, that's what I give people. That's what they should read if they want to work in this business. And again, as I say, she has succeeded enormously in this business.
Oh, thank you for saying that, Ben. I mean, I have to say that for me, it was about, I mean, obviously there are gossipy elements to it, but for me, it was just, I love seeing how things work and the organism, and making a movie is just such a huge, complicated enterprise, and to have access to all of it. And the truth is, I was as interested in, the sound guy that used coconuts to make the sound of horses' hoofs going as the movie stars. It was just riveting to me.
Thank you. Mike from the Video Attic, you're up next. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. My question is for Julie. If you were to cast Bonfires, who would be the lead for you if you would cast it?
Well, probably at the time, my choice would have been somebody like William Hurt. I mean, he's just sort of what you think about. I don't think Tom Hanks was ultimately a bad choice. It's just people brought so much baggage to it. Because I think William Hurt was sort of what you would classically think of as somebody in that position. But the truth is, if you go on a trading floor of bond traders, there are as many people who look like Tom Hanks as William Hurt.
But there's the ones who've succeeded to the point that Sherman had look more like William Hurt, don't they? I mean, that was sort of the idea to me, that maybe Hanks was a little young for that part.
Well, yes and no, because it's a young man's business. It's like the movie business. People burn out. So, but I think you're right, Ben, in that I think part of this is what your imagination of that kind of person is. And Bill Hurt definitely was that person. And Peter Fallow probably was definitely not going to be Bruce Willis in anybody's imagination. I think when they decided to go with an American, somebody like Jack Nicholson, or who had that kind of waggish but sneaky intelligence, I think would have been a lot more interesting. And I actually thought Melanie I thought she did a great job actually as Maria. I mean, I think you could buy her as the devil's candy.
Totally.
Thank you. Cammie from the Classic Couple.
Great, thank you. This is for Judy, and I want to make sure I get this right, but in the 2002 edition of your book, you have your afterword, right, in which you recap the 10 years after lunch with Brian De Palma, and you quote him as saying, maybe 20, 30 years later, I'll be able to look upon it like an old photograph, but not yet. And so now it's that 30-year mark, right? My understanding, Brian is aware of this project, but doesn't really want to revisit the film. So if you will indulge me, I have two questions. So from what you know of Brian De Palma, do you think the Bonfire of the Vanities will ever become that old photograph that he will reminisce about? And then sort of two parts, just kind of what is your vantage point now reflecting on this work at 30 years? Thank you so much.
Sure. So honestly, I think it will never be easy for him to look back at this movie. And unfortunately, I think the reason is because of the devil's candy. I think that had it just been another movie that didn't work, I mean, Brian's whole career has been up and down, and he'd be the first person to say that. But this one became a particular down because of my book. And believe me, for me, that's been an agony, because I really respect him and like him so much. And yet this thing that I'm also very proud of, which is my book, is the thing that's like this perpetual thorn in his side. Having said that, when I told him about the podcast, he was excited about it. He loved the first season of Plot Thickens, and I just think it's hard for him. So I don't know, maybe at 50 years, but if that when he's very old, but not yet. And the second question, what's the second question again? Sorry.
Just a little of your vantage point, reflecting at 30 years.
So reflecting at 30 years is incredibly strange for me. So that baby that I had right at the beginning, luckily was not scarred by my negligent motherhood that first year. I really wasn't negligent, but it was an interesting first year. Is now 31 and about to get married. So that's sort of a different vantage point for me. But looking back at the film and what happened while it was being made, I think if anybody's worked in any kind of an organization, nothing there should surprise anyone about the kinds of conversations people have, the way people make decisions, the ups and downs of the intensity of that project. And looking back on it, I think I feel more compassion for everybody, including myself, about how crazy the whole thing was. But also I feel incredibly, Natalia, who's the co-producer on this project, hates the word poignant, but there is a kind of poignancy to it, and certainly nostalgia for me to hear all the, to see Tom Hanks as a, 33 or 34-year-old, and Melanie Griffith as a young woman going through these kinds of, struggle professionally, privately. There's something really incredible to me about it. So, and to hear their voices on those tapes, which, I had no idea I even had. It's just been a remarkable experience to look back on it. But, I feel good about it, to be honest, and that's a nice feeling, because sometimes you don't.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, Jim from Real Talker.
Hey, Ben, I got a question for you. How did this whole season, why was it this story that you ultimately decided on to tell for this season? What went into it? What was sort of the process? Because I wasn't even aware of the movie. I'm in my early 30s in a sense, and I just didn't know about it until I started researching about it. So there's a whole generation of us, especially on the younger side of it, that doesn't even know about this movie with these major stars kind of went hidden for us maybe. But what about this story that really, as opposed to probably you had so many other choices, what made this the definitive choice to tell this story and come together with Julie on this? Was there another choice that was close up to do, or was this something you just wanted to do from the start? So just wanted to hear kind of on the process of selecting this for season 2.
There were no other choices. There were no other stories to tell in Hollywood. We were out of stories to tell. You answered the question in asking it, and it was really it was not. We weren't thinking, after we completed. I'm Still Peter Bogdanovich, our first season. We didn't think, let's find a giant box office failure that's where it's richly told, or a success. It was this opportunity that developed to partner with Julie, with Campside Media, with Natalia. It was an opportunity to tell a story that we can't. Our genius is just recognizing an opportunity. Julie wanted to tell this story at the same time. She had these tapes from her interviews, these recordings of her interviews for the book, and then we were again smart enough to recognize, wait a minute, this is probably something that we shouldn't pass up. And I'm grateful for their interest in partnering with us. And for us, it was a pretty easy decision. The idea of the Plot Thickens is that we're going to tell compelling Hollywood stories. I mean, that's anybody who's a storyteller wants to tell compelling stories. So, we think we found that with Peter, that we thought that sort of career arc, which is marked by some failure, right? Which is this really talented filmmaker, one of the seminal filmmakers of the era, along with Brian. And then, you know, he's got failure and he has some arrogance and he has tragedy and he has his own interesting brand of humility about it now too. And that's what I thought made it a compelling story. So, and here's again, the story about a failure, but it's not about failures. It's about a really interesting artistic failure. In some degrees, it's a failure. Of course, it's a success in other degrees. It's that, you know, I mean, it's people's jobs and they created a piece of art and here we are 30 years later talking about it. So, but I love the idea of failure. So I'm trying not to use that word as pejoratively as it sounds. Like, to me, I want to shake Brian. I'm sure he's very eager to be shaken by me, and say, no, man, like, don't, like, you should be talking about it. You should be talking to Julie about it and me. I would hope. I would love to be there. I'd love to interview the two of them together for a long time. But because like what makes Carrie interesting, what makes The Untouchables interesting, what makes Casualties of War interesting, what makes Blowout interesting, what makes Dress to Kill interesting, even more interesting, is that there's Bonfire, right? And there are others. Like, that's what makes Brian interesting, is the how something with as talented and as visionary as he is didn't work. And then there's 1,000 reasons, and putting it on Brian is a huge simplicity. So that to me is interesting, and that makes it a compelling story. And the fact that, again, my enormously talented cousin, that she recognized that, like, you want to learn about Hollywood, certainly vaguely modern Hollywood. We may have entered another era now, but post studio Hollywood and how things are done, you can learn it in Bonfire. I mean, you can learn it in Devil's Candy about Bonfire. It's the book to read. It is the best Hollywood book I've ever read, and I've read now a lot of them. So the opportunity to tell that story with the creator of that story, that seemed like again, it was a no-brainer. It's not what we set out to do, but then the opportunity presented itself and we seized it.
And also, just to follow up on what Ben said, Jim, I think part of it is, you know, I think people always think there's some grand plan to things, you know, even with movies. I mean, I was a movie critic, and I can't tell you how many times, probably I did it as well, but movie critics will say, oh, the director did such and such because of fill in the blank. And then when you're actually watching how or why things happen, it's usually just this whole series of circumstances that fall into place a certain way. So with this, you know, did Ben and TCM think about doing The Devil's Candy as season 2? I didn't even think of doing The Devil's Candy as season anything. I was sitting here minding my own business in the middle of a pandemic, and I get this email through my website from Mad Share at Campside saying, have you ever thought of doing The Devil's Candy as a podcast series? And I thought, no, but sure, why not? And that was really how it started. And after I got that note and they were interested, I literally went with my son to Manhattan Mini Storage to go and climbed up this dangerous little ladder and lifted a lot of heavy boxes out and found this box. And I had no idea I had saved those tapes. And I had all here, I can show you. I have all these, you know, endless folders of typed transcript of not only the tapes, but of my notes, because I was so paranoid that I wouldn't let anybody else type them. So it was just, you know, and there's boxes of those things. So, but it was just, everything just kind of fell into place. And then Campside approached TCM and they were interested. So it was just this series of, you know, lucky events that's really turned out to be amazing for me. I've never done anything like this, and it's been so much fun.
Wow, unbelievable. Thank you, guys.
Sure.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Judy Shields at the Hollywood Times for Ben. How do you feel about doing the podcast as opposed to being on camera?
Well, I mean, I love it. I don't want to pretend I like being on television. How you guys doing? You know, I would say I like this as well or better. It's just a different, it's real storytelling, and it enables more of my personality to come out. So I like it. I like, I'm a people person. No, I like collaborating. And I'm at my best when I collaborate. I think a lot of us are, but I'm certain of that about myself. Is rarely frustrating for me. Somebody rarely tells me something to do something differently, and that I don't bristle sort of when it's creative the way I might if my wife tells me to do something, or my 8-year-old who's figured out that she is capable of doing that now. And so I like it. And I like this manner of storytelling. I'm really grateful for it. I love radio. I liked when I had a political show that I did for a while called The Young Turks that I started. And when we, the guy I started it with, Cenk Uygur, who's done very well for himself, is a good friend of mine. And he, since I left, but he, after about 3 or 4 years of doing the show, he was like, we're going to put cameras in and we're going to put up all these videos on YouTube. And I was like, that's a terrible idea. No one will watch videos of people just talking. Like I liked it when it was a radio show. So I don't get how this business works, but I am grateful that podcasting has emerged, and that, and it's sort of, again, saluting old radio. And I like this form of storytelling. I'm just much more relaxed. It's a different, you're not putting makeup on, you're not putting a tie on. And there's something, as much as I try, and everybody who's good at being on television, who's a broadcaster, and that's the job I think I myself is having, everybody who does that, it's the moment you start talking into a camera when you're not really talking to anyone, right? This is different. We're all having a conversation. I mean, there's modern aspects to it. And obviously we're all in our homes and it is a camera, but we're having a conversation. I mean, right now I'm just droning on, but technically this is a conversation. But as soon as the lights go on in a studio and there's a camera and you start talking to no one, it is instantly artificial. And then your job is to work backwards as hard as you can to make it seem as to minimize the artificiality of it and to bring some authenticity to it. But this, to me, from start to finish, feels authentic, this manner of storytelling. So I love both, and I have no interest in, I'm certainly not giving up the other one, but I'm thrilled that we were able to add this.
Thank you. Jeffrey with KCLV TV, go ahead.
Ben, TCM is also hosting a night dedicated to Brian De Palma, which if you could tell us a little bit about that, and will Julie be making appearances throughout the night talking about the latest podcast here?
She came, but we wouldn't let her in the studio. She was like, let me bang it on the door. No, of course, we're doing it with Julie. It's me and Julie hosting a night of Brian De Palma movies. We're starting with, I'll make sure I get them right. We're starting with Bonfire. And which is making its TCM premiere. I think this is the day after the 4th of July. I think this is on July 5th that you can check this out. So we start with Bonfire, and then Obsession, Sisters. I think those are the only 3 Julie and I do together, but then we also have Blowout and Body Double. So, and it's sort of, we see the movies, but mostly it's Julie, talking about Brian, talking about what kind of director he is, sharing the stories, some of which are in The Devil's Candy, some of which aren't. And just, again, mostly because what's not in The Devil's Candy, of course, is what has become her now 30 plus year friendship with Brian De Palma. So, and Obsession and Sisters, Bonfire is a TCM premiere, and I don't know whether I think we've shown both Obsession and Sisters, but they don't show up regularly on TCM. So they're going to be new to a lot of people, and they're both weird in their wonderful De Palma-ness. And I think they're unquestionably worth seeing. They're really good. I mean, they're weird, but they're very good films, both of them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Aurora, go ahead.
Hi, both Jim and Jeffrey took my questions, but I came up with another one. I'm wondering if the other players like Bruce and Tom and Melanie know about this and how they feel about the podcast or the idea of it if they haven't listened to it.
I don't know. I mean, I know that TCM reached out to different people to see if they wanted to participate, and none of it was interesting. None of the above the line people wanted to participate, but a lot of the other people did. And not to give anything away in subsequent episodes, But what was really remarkable, I did do fresh interviews with a lot of people, the first assistant director, the producer, the line producer, a lot of the people who worked on the film. And what's fascinating to me is their memory of being on that film is not, oh my God, I worked on that disaster, but oh my God, how much I learned being on that film, how amazing it was to work with Brian, how incredible it was to be on this huge thing, shot on the streets of New York. And so most of them have this remarkably positive feeling about the experience and sadness that it didn't work out.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, let me add, and without again spoilers, the many people involved in the movie participated, and there was we reached out as we always do. These are incredible. Tom Hanks is a very busy person. He's a professional actor. Of some success, and so we reached out to all these people, and I don't even know what the exact reactions were, but there was no negativity at all. I mean, most people, in general, I mean, you have a little hint into talent booking. Almost everyone says no. So that's just so it was all very polite and encouragement, and there's not they're all none of their representatives, so there was no issue. So again, it's not no one. If anyone read Julie's book and they were angry about it, I don't think they were. I don't think they read it right. Right. That really, it doesn't come. I don't think there's a hostile moment in that book or an aggressive moment in that book. So, this is an interesting story to tell. And again, still talking about this movie. I guess maybe that's part of the reason. Maybe some people are like, I don't want to talk about this movie, but it hasn't come close to defining the career of anyone involved in it.
Thank you. Cammie from the Classic Couple, go ahead.
Great, thank you. And Julie and Ben, if I can maybe get both of your perspectives on this, but Julie, I feel like I'm quoting you back to you, but I want to get this right. So you describe the devil's candy as, and I'm quoting, that impossible, expensive, possibly monumental thing. And you questioned that Hollywood, this is back in 1990, of course, that Hollywood would not learn its lesson to scale back. In 1990, you were talking about scaling back. And so I was just wondering if I could get your perspective, and then Ben, perhaps your perspective. Here we are 30 years later. Do you think that Hollywood still feeds on that devil's candy?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think our whole society does to a certain extent. But what's different now in a very positive way are all these other outlets. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities, both on television, in low budget movies, on your iPhone, for people to do all kinds of small projects. I think what's sad to me in a way is that it's harder and harder to get the big budget, old-fashioned Hollywood movie. That I think you just don't see that much anymore, unless it's, a Marvel, nothing against a Marvel superhero movie, love that. But something that may be, the kind of movie that Bonfire of the Vanities was aspiring to be, something that's, maybe for grown-ups. And that to me is sad. And the budgets have definitely not come under control, even though one would think maybe they could be with all this technology at your fingertips. So many things could be so much easier, but that just doesn't seem to happen. And that has to do with salaries and all different kinds of things. I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, yes. The kind of, Bonfire was such a big, what was the budget on Bonfire? What did it end up at, Julie?
Like $50 million. It doesn't even seem like that much anymore.
Yeah. And It was 30 years ago, but still you could even have topped that then. So, but what there isn't anymore, and Julie and I talked about this when she was in Atlanta to shoot the Night at De Palma movies. I think we did. Is that what's gone is the middle range movie, right? I mean, we know the Marvel movies and Warner Brothers is going to have the DC movies, but what is showing up that what television has done with what these wonderful shows, right? These great shows have done is it's almost like they've filled the void of the grown-up adult drama. And that is wonderful because there's so many of them. And ultimately it's still Game of Thrones those were 53-minute movies, right? Each week. Those were Sopranos, right? Those were not, I didn't feel like episodic television. And now there are all these great shows, but what is missing again is what what people I know in the business, and I don't know anything about the business, but producer friends say, 10 million, 15, up to 25, $30 million movies, big budget. That's a real budget, right? To make something, but they're not 150 million, 200 million, 100 million. So there was the movie released, gosh, I guess it was on HBO Max. So I guess it's Warner Brothers. I should probably know since, it's our company, but, and if it's not, I'm sorry. Those Who Wish Me Dead. Yeah. So that was the Angelina Jolie movie. And she's like jumps out of airplanes to fight fires. And what's his name? John Berthal is in that movie, and Aidan Gillen, from The Wire and Game of Thrones. And I liked that movie, and it wasn't really my kind of movie, and some of it was unrealistic or whatever, but I felt like, oh man, this is the kind of movie that came out in the 90s, and that's great. I'm totally fine with that. I think about like the Judge with Robert Duvall and Robert Downey Jr. And I know that was some time ago, but I always think like that movie just does, like, I can't believe it got even made when it did, because that movie that kind of movie is from a totally different era. And now if that happened, it would be a limited series, right? It would be Mayor of Easttown, which was phenomenal, right? But wasn't a movie. So that's too bad that we look at either $1 million movies, these little independent movies, $1.2 million, people cobble together, which could turn out to be great. And obviously there are some exceptions, but it's not the budget for the stuff in the middle that's for grownups. We're obviously catering to a young adult and teenage audience with the big mainstream movies, and certainly the movies that catch your eye, that have the billboards, that get the press attention. So that's regrettable, but it's not like there is, I'm not going to use the word content, but it's not like there's not really good storytelling available to see on a screen.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you. John from the Hollywood Soapbox.
Hi, thank you for the follow-up. I'm curious, the book, Tom Wolfe's book, is certainly seen as a modern classic, and the movie less so. So I know that there's a lot of personalities that you documented, and that'll come through in the podcast as well. But do you also believe that there was sort of an original sin, and that you had a book that maybe wasn't perfectly adaptable for a film, and that the challenge was going to be met by any director and any cast?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tom Wolfe said it right from the get-go, that he always described his books as the series of slices of life, and interestingly enough, I'm sure that if somebody had been wanting to adapt it today, they would have done it as a limited series for television, which it's probably more suited to, because then you could really delve into all those individual characters. What's interesting about Bonfire of the Vanities, the book now, I was actually on some kind of panel a few weeks ago, a podcast, where they were talking about the Bonfire of the Vanities. And, that book itself has become a hot potato in a different way now because of all the racial stuff in it, that just today would be much harder to adapt for all kinds of sensitivities. Even though I think Tom Wolfe was doing a satire, I think it would be extremely difficult to adapt today for probably the same reasons that it was difficult to adapt 30 years ago, but with a 2021 variation on it. So yeah, I think the book itself was really tough. On the other hand, I think it would make a terrific miniseries, with all these great character actors playing those roles.
Thank you. Mike from the Video Attic, go ahead.
Hi, this question's for Julie. I was just curious when the last time you saw Bonfire of the Vanities, and is it kind of strange watching it again, just being so close to the production?
Well, I saw it again just a couple months ago when we started working on this. I definitely watched it a few times. And yeah, it's always been strange for me to watch, because for me, it is like that photo album of my experience on the set. So I kind of think, oh yeah, that's right before I interviewed so-and-so or such and such. But having said that, I've always felt that the movies, in its own crazy way, is a lot of fun. You know, that if you take it kind of scene by scene, it's just mind boggling. You know, the thing about Brian De Palma is that he never makes a boring movie. You know, you always know you're going to see something. So kind of the question that you guys asked before about what do you miss seeing in the movies, the big budget, it's not even so much a question of big movies, but just something that visually kind of knocks your socks off, because it's just so interesting and somebody's really having fun concocting ideas of how to create this scene. And, you know, in an interesting way, Brian De Palma and Tom Wolfe were not so different from one another, because Tom Wolfe, I mean, if you read his books, these crazy sentences and, you know, made up words, and, you know, it's wild. And Brian is the same way. I mean, he just wants everything to be interesting. So for me, watching the movie, I mean, I could never watch it as a film critic, actually. First of all, I've seen it way too many times and have too many other feelings about it. But to me, it's, you know, I just think it's really interesting. And I think that, well, it'll be something for people to see when it shows on TCM. You know, people will be able to experience it. And I think it will be a surprise for a lot of people. Like, why was this considered such a big disaster? I can name 5 other movies that came out that year that were 10 times worse.
Yeah, thank you. I exactly agree. It's such an interesting film. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim from Real Talker.
So this is kind of a question for both of you. You know, especially with the podcast, The Plot Thickens, you know, in this industry, there's a lot of, in a sense, sometimes pandering. There's not, you know, it's tough to sometimes share your honest opinion. And I feel being in your positions, both of you, you too, Julie, as a critic, how do you navigate the relationships that you make? Because you often, you know, it's easy to say nice things about a project or an actor, but there's failures too. And how do you navigate the personal relationships you have with these directors and actors, in a sense, and offer the fair criticism that is, if it's a bad project, bad performance, but yet, you know, not to offend them enough. And I'm sure, Ben, you can speak about it with what you had with Peter too. How do you approach that, and how receptive are they usually to criticism or not? Because we know it's like, it's tough sometimes to bring someone on a podcast. You want to see a lot of positive things. You don't want to make it negative in a sense and offend someone. But what's the navigation that you guys have learned over the years with some of these very prominent figures, you know, that don't have to do interviews or don't have to talk to certain people? How do you maintain the professional aspect and then the personal, maybe relationship and friendship, and in a sense, keep it fair all the way around, but not be afraid to, in a sense, offer critique or bring up some uncomfortable moments?
Well, I think Ben and I come at this from different positions, because he has to actually talk to people over and over again at some point, and lives in LA. I live in New York. And the truth is, while I was a critic, the only person I really became friends with was Brian. And I actually stopped reviewing his movies after that, after Bonfire of the Vanities, not out of malice, but because I felt I couldn't be objective about them. You know, as a film critic at some place like at a paper like the Wall Street Journal, you're discouraged from actually becoming close to anybody. You know, I wrote profiles of a lot of people, Steven Spielberg, major characters in Hollywood and major film executives. I wrote some pretty tough stories, and I couldn't really be friends with those people, not because I didn't like them, but because exactly what you're saying, it would cloud your judgment. My friendship with Brian is a rare thing. It's happened to me once. And even with the book, there were many times when I was writing the book that I just had to zone out my personal feelings to tell the truth. But I also tried not to be mean, and I'm sure there are people who say, well, you were mean because I described something that they might not like, but I tried not to be gratuitously, just snide or something like that. But, I did, after a few years after I wrote this book, I stopped being a critic for exactly the reason you're talking about. Not even exactly that reason. It was really more like, having written a book myself, and I've subsequently written many books, I've experienced what it's like to work so hard on something, to do such a good job, or you think you have. And a lot of people will respond positively, but there's always people who don't. I'm sure when our podcasts come out, there'll be people who say, who don't have a good reaction to it. And part of what I tell myself is, well, just take it like a woman, because you used to do the same thing. But it does complicate relationships. And I wonder what it's like for Ben, because he lives right there.
So I was a critic for a while, and I didn't even like the term, and I wasn't very good at it, to be honest. I did the Ebert and Siskel and Ebert show for a year, and very publicly lost that job, which was humbling and embarrassing, and all the reasons that you would think it would be embarrassing to sort of have it be news when you, at least in the movie world. It wasn't big news, but it was, in the movie world, to sort of fail publicly. So that's one reason why I'm interested in failure. I failed publicly. And, but I, some of my best friends are critics. And that's true. I did a show. I mean, I worked with Matt Atchity and Lonzo Giraldi. Christy Lemire was the AP film critic for 13 years, works for the Ebert website now, and still does their show's now called A Breakfast All Day, that I used to be on under a different name. And What the Flick was when we did it. But those guys are great. And they have what they say. I learned something every time I listened to one of their reviews, every time I sat down with them. But it was hard for me to criticize somebody else's art that I watched for 2 hours and then thought about for 13 minutes before going into review sometime. And I would tell people officially that I know I was very sober and I wrote and thought it out. But sometimes, whatever, you get busy, you're doing 3 or 4 movies in a day, and to be flippant about something that people worked really hard on, it didn't sit well with me. Personally, I wasn't good at it. And I could take a shot at, like, there were very few directors who I felt, I was like, Michael Bay, he doesn't care. And he's a billionaire, and he knows his movies are like super loud, right? And he's fine. Like I could, but like short of that, it was hard for me. And then with TCM, with wanting to get these people to come in and talk about some of their work on the air, or getting them to come in and talk about other people's work, right? To get, George Lucas to come in and talk about how he was influenced by Westerns, right? I don't want to criticize George Lucas, and I don't know if that makes me weak or, but I'll say this, that I went to Columbia Journalism School, and because I was a journalist for the first basically 10 years of my career. And we had a guy, some of you may know, because he works for NPR now. I still think he does. He was, at the time, there was the Supreme Court reporter for the Baltimore Sun. He covered the Supreme Court for like 58 years, Lyle Denniston. And he came in and talked to us like in the first month at Columbia. And he said, look, man, I cover the Supreme Court. So I know these justices, to call them, right? And when I need to, and to call their clerks when I need to. And sometimes they give me important information. He goes, but I went to one thing, some Sunday he went, and people were playing tennis and they schmoozed and they drank. This was like, in 1965, he's talking to us in like, whatever it was, 1992. And I'm telling his story slightly incorrectly, but the gist of it was, he was like, I totally see the problem. I can never do this again. I can't be friends with these people. I can't go play tennis. He goes, a lot of reporters do, they get information. He goes, I'm not even knocking them. He's saying, I cannot do it.
Yeah.
So that's it. And I think that's true. And Julie expressed exactly why it's true, why she stopped reviewing Brian movies, right? She likes him too much. And So I don't care. I like artists, man. I like talking to them. I like talking to them about their business. And I think they're interesting. I like living out here. I think there's so many smart, creative people here. I love defending LA but I'm not going to turn around then and talk about why you shouldn't go see the thing that they spent sometimes like 6.5 years making in some capacity, right? Because I'm like, that sucked. That script was stupid. Like, I don't know, man. I know I'm making fun of critics and I don't mean to, because there's huge value in it. Like the first time somebody sketched out a drawing on the wall of a cave, right? He was like, look at what I've created, right? And then a couple people walked by and was like, that sucks, right? And I'm like, hey, look, there's criticism. So art criticism is valid, it's vital, it's necessary. I'm not good at it, and I'm going to leave it to other people.
Thank you for the transparency. Really appreciate it from both of you.
Thank you. Jeffrey from KCLV, you're up next.
Yes. First of all, Ben, I just want to say how much I loved you and your brother, Josh, when you were doing all the courtroom stuff. I never missed it. So have him back soon. That was just one of the best series.
Oh, thanks. We'd love to, that'd be great to do that every couple of years. Just something dateliney. Thank you. I'll tell him.
And don't feel too rejected about Siskel and Ebert, because I have my letter from the producer's rejection when I wanted to be a guest critic. I wrote to them. So this is my 26th year as a film critic. And I had those problems too. Not so much about trashing a film, but personal questions. I don't ask personal questions like a lot of entertainment reporters do. So that's always difficulty when publicists are saying, don't ask about the relationship. Of course not. That's nothing like that. So now I know that it's a little bit off in the distance, but can you give us a little tease about the Lucy podcast? Because I'm a huge Lucy fan. Are you going to concentrate on her movie career, or just can you give us a little preview? Because that's exciting too.
Yeah. So we're working on these things simultaneously. I think it's going to be great. I just put my voice down for episode 1 last night. We don't do them in order. What most people, I guess you guys would know. I don't know. I didn't even know. Julie may not have known. Now she knows. Like, you don't just think, all right, so how should we tell this story? All right, we'll do this one. We'll tell it at the beginning. Like, man, these, every episode is the entire series is mapped out. Every episode is mapped out very carefully. Different writers, different producers are assigned to different episodes to get them done at different times. It is a dance. And so that part has blown me away a little bit. This is a collaborative artistic endeavor. Every podcast you like, every single podcast you like, you have given too much credit to the host, not enough credit to the producer, and not nearly enough credit to the person really responsible for you liking it, the audio engineer, the sound engineer.
Yes.
What these guys can do to tell stories, it's amazing. And I should have known. When I was in news, obviously I worked with editors. I got to tell you, it's not on my resume. It never has been. I don't talk about it much. I spent what was I there? I was there from like almost 9 months, including 6 months on the air at the beginning of TMZ, the TV show. TCM let me do it. None of us really knew what it was. I didn't know TMZ, the website. I did it for a friend, a former managing editor of mine in Miami, Bryn Friedman. It was her fault. And she was like, no, this is going to be like the Daily Show, but about entertainment. Blah, blah. She was wrong. Anyway, she got fired, which is a great badge of honor for her before I started. And I didn't like that time of my life, although I came away impressed both with Harvey Levin, he was like Walter Cronkite. He was involved in every aspect of the show, and that was impressive to me. And these were mostly good people, but we'd have like 22 seconds of material of somebody coming out of a garage who I'd never heard of, talking about a show I'd never seen. And it'd be and then I would be like, I have to do 2 minutes on this, or 1:40. And those audio editors, man, they are editors, not just, they weren't audio editors, but they were editors. But the way they would play with audio, they would turn these, because, that show is engaging, right? And it was really engaging from the start. It wasn't about anything that I care about, and I quit, which was the greatest thing. And they let me walk out on a contract. So God bless them. I'm not knocking them, but what those editors could do was amazing. They would turn nothing into something. And we never give enough credit to it in movies and certainly in podcasts, because of course, there's no visual component to it. So, they really make things sing. Like sometimes I'll be going through a script and I'll be like, well, this can't work. And our director, our executive producer of the podcast, Angela Carone, will be like, it's going to be fine. Wait till Mike Voulgaris gets a hold of it. Wait till he edits this. Wait till he puts it together. And inevitably you're like, oh, wow, that was impressive. So they're the stars. And I'm not just trying to be a guy who sort of calls out somebody below the line. They shouldn't be below the line. They really are in nearly every way, other than the subject, the most important person, the most important artist involved in podcasts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike from the Video Attic, go ahead.
Hi, yes, this question's for both Julie and Ben. What's your personal favorite Brian De Palma film?
I have three favorites. Let me divide them by category. I'd say my favorite crowd pleaser film is, The Untouchables is just fun, and I love the dying scene of Sean Connery. It's just amazing. But I love Blowout. I think of his thrillers, it's by far my favorite, and I love all of them. But that one, I think it's an incredible movie, and I appreciate it. Actually, that was something I appreciated even more after I did The Devil's Candy, because when I got to see the sound guy operating, it really elevated that work of the sound engineer. So I thought that was amazing, and also to see John Travolta in that role was incredible. And it's hard to say as favorite movie, but I thought his most powerfully emotional movie was Casualties of War. It's just an incredible war epic, and it's a movie that is so hard to watch because it's so painful, but it is, for something that is such a painful movie, is stunningly beautiful, and really good. But there's a lot of other ones I like. I'm a fan. I love his movies. I think they're great. But those three, I think, are really, really, oh my God, and Scarface, which I mainly love because I started watching it with my son, who's 8, when he was 8, which is completely inappropriate. But Brian actually gave him a poster signed to Eli. And, we have so much Scarface paraphernalia around our house, it's embarrassing.
That's great.
Julie is named, it'll seem like I'm just copping out, but I'm not. And I've thought about this since we've started doing this, but I love Blowout, always have. Saw in a theater, remember seeing it in a theater and thinking that was cool. Those were cool people. And and it didn't seem like other movies. It felt very European. That sounded arrogant, but I meant that in a cool way, right? And I love The Untouchables. I'm a Costner fan. I'm a Connery fan. They were so good. They were perfect. And so The Untouchables is great. And then I agree to 100% on Casualties of War. Casualties of War is great film. And for, it was a personal film for Brian, emotional film for him to make but it's part of the story of Bonfire, right? Coming out of Casualties of War. That's sort of, if Casualties of War had gone differently, he might not have made Bonfire. That fair to say, Julie, right?
Yeah, very fair.
I haven't seen it. I may have only seen it start to finish twice. I saw it when it came out when I was definitely too young for it, but it was great. And then saw it again and still liked it. I don't know whether it would hold up. It probably wouldn't. I know there would be some problematic aspects to it, but I love Dressed to Kill, and there are still moments in it that are, there are scenes, and this is the sign of a great director. There's 3 scenes in Dressed to Kill that I know, I see them, I can imagine them in my head. And that's Brian, right? That's Brian creating those shots. And I'm biased because I don't just, it's like a crazy crush on Angie Dickinson, who's so, it was a crush before I knew her. Now it's legit. I could, it's impossible not to love Angie Dickinson. It can't be done. And I think she's a super underappreciated actress.
Yeah.
I would have a group of 4 that would include those 3 and Dress to Kill. But as you said, I mean, I'm not, anytime you make one of these lists, I'm like, I don't mean to diss Scarface, right? I like Scarface, right? You know, I like Carlito's Way. Anyway, so Carrie, for crying out loud, right? And the ones we have, Sisters, Obsession. These are fun movies. He's a terrific, he's a defining filmmaker of the defining modern era of American films, American movie making.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And final question of the day goes to Cammie at the Classic Couple.
Thanks so much. So just circling us right on back to Bonfire, Julie, I wanted to ask you, of course, you had unprecedented access, right? As an author and an observer. And if you can think back, what do you think was the most surprising thing you discovered about Hollywood filmmaking in this process?
I think the most surprising thing was I'm going to use the word chaos, but not in terms of it being a mess, but just it's almost deliberate chaos. There's so many things, especially for a movie like that that's so big. There's just so many different things. It's like a corporation in a way, or I think Spielberg, or people used to talk about the factory of the studio, but this is different because this is sort of like a conglomeration of all these things going on simultaneously, and just thinking about what the director has to hold in his or her head while they're making this film. I mean, it was hard enough for me to write, it's hard enough to write a book, to keep all the different pieces in, but here it's all these people and places and the 3-dimensionality of it, just the organizational part was something I just never thought of. You're moving tons of people and equipment and stuff. There's construction, there's all these different aspects to it. And yeah, I guess at some level I must have known that, but to actually be there, I think that was just a constant astonishment. So, the fact that any movie ever gets made is a miracle. And the fact that some of them are actually good is even more of a miracle.
Totally. But let me just say quickly to anybody, you guys out there, and anybody who loves movies, on the off chance, and just odds are at least one of you hasn't read The Devil's Candy. You'll love it. Like, it's just so good, because no matter how much you think you know about movie making, it will change how you think about it. Right. I mean, it changed Julie. She watched it and she was like, oh my God, I had no idea they did this. She was a film critic for the freaking Wall Street Journal. Right. And she didn't know. Right. You can't know. That's the beauty. That's why The Devil's Candy, the book, is so valuable, because it just teaches you so much about this business, this weird. And of course, it's a catastrophe in a sense, because it's this $50 million of business money, of corporate money invested in a bunch of lunatic artists like Brian De Palma. Right. Of course, the potential for conflict is enormous. I mean, which is why we're doing the podcast, which is why she wrote the book. Right. Because it's these forces coming together that, they're oil and water. In many ways, they don't belong together. But, when it works, it's amazing. Right. And when it doesn't work, you can learn from it. And there are parts of it that are still amazing. Again, there's value. I like seeing movies that don't work. Right. Sometimes it's fun. It's interesting. So anyway, that's so whatever you're doing, man, if it's been more than 10 years since you've read the book, just read it. You'll love it, and it'll help you fall in love with movies.
Okay, and I'll put in a plug because of the podcast. The book that book came out before there were audiobooks, so I got commissioned to do an audio version. So talk about, like Ben was, talk about hard and the necessity of sound engineers. I did the audio version of The Devil's Candy, which has just come out, and it's incredible. It was such an incredible experience because, I'm sitting there, COVID, in this booth, and there's this sound engineer outside, and then the director up on the Zoom screen, and it's even in that modest little scale, how difficult that is just to, the idea is to keep people awake as you're reading this thing. And so, it takes a lot of work to do that.
It is really hard to record more than about 30 minutes at a time and not be in your head thinking that this is horrible. Like, and you forget how to say, like, I spent 2 hours recording the first Lucy episode last night. And by the end, I was like, next time on the Plot Thickens, no, that's horrible. Next time on the Plot Thickens. And you're like, I can't speak. I don't know. How do people say this? How do people do it? So and I haven't done a whole audio book. So I just, you lose your brain stops functioning in a way that it would normally. And then you do it 12 times and then the engineer will get it and he'll be like, yeah, they all sound exactly the same. It's fine. But in your head, it's a catastrophe.